opens diagonal for the queen and bishop, aiming for rapid central influence and aggressive development. Immediately contesting central territory with a pawn, this Sicilian defense signals black's intention for an unbalanced, dynamic struggle. Unleashing central influence, knight aims to quickly develop and support pawn advances, setting the stage for a dynamic fight. Immediately establishing a pawn triangle, black fortifies their center and prepares for potential piece development, setting a defensive yet active posture against white's aggressive opening. Challenging the center immediately, this pawn thrust ignites a dynamic struggle for central space and opens lines for rapid piece development. Opening the central d-file allows for immediate piece activity and potential pressure, a classic Sicilian trade. Centralizing the knight immediately contests the d-file's openness. Instantly challenging the knight, this move initiates a lively Sicilian battle, forcing white to commit their central piece and opening pathways for black's pieces. Developing the knight here opens diagonals and prepares for castling, while black faces a choice of fighting for the center or allowing white a comfortable advantage. Preparing nc6 to challenge the knight on d4 and gaining control of the b5 square for future piece development. Preventing the knight's intrusion to g4 is the immediate goal, subtly preparing for a potential kingside pawn advance later. Opening up the diagonal for your queen and preparing to fianchetto your bishop creates a solid pawn structure, but it concedes central space, so be mindful of white's developing pieces. Unleashing a pawn storm on the kingside, white aggressively seeks to tear open lines against black's monarch, creating a dynamic imbalance that promises sharp, tactical play and demands precise calculation from both sides. Creating a defensive bulwark becomes paramount with this pawn push, as it preemptively blocks the g5 advance and prepares a potential g5 counterattack, aiming to disrupt white's aggressive pawn formation on the kingside. Bringing the bishop to g2 solidifies this flank's defense while preparing to castle kingside and creating a potentially potent battery along the long diagonal, a common theme in this Sicilian variation. Developing the knight to its natural square here eyes central influence and prepares for potential kingside castling, whilst also challenging white's imposing pawn chain on the kingside and setting up active counterplay. Discarding the knight for the bishop creates an immediate structural imbalance, potentially opening lines for your queen and rook while forcing black to recapture, solidifying your central pawn presence and initiating a strategic concession that might prove costly later. This capture immediately opens the b-file for your rook, but at the cost of creating doubled pawns, which could become a permanent weakness if not addressed carefully. Consider how you'll utilize that newly active file and whether your pawn structure will hold up under pressure. Challenging the pawn chain so aggressively immediately creates an unstable central situation and opens lines of attack, but at the cost of weakening your own king's shield and potentially creating isolated pawns later if black responds with dxc5. This sharpens the game considerably, forcing black to calculate concrete variations and avoid passive responses lest their position collapse under the pressure. The knight bravely ventures into enemy territory, immediately challenging white's central pawn and aiming to disrupt its advanced position. This injection of life into the d5 square offers black significant counterplay, potentially opening lines for attack and creating dynamic imbalances. It's a bold assertion of presence, seeking to exploit the slightly loose nature of white's pawn structure. Opening the central file for your rook creates immediate tactical possibilities, forcing black to address the pawn structure around their king. Reclaiming the pawn opens up the bishop's diagonal, though black must be wary of the exposed kingside pawn structure and the potential for white's pieces to coordinate effectively. This bishop development, while natural, doesn't immediately resolve the doubled c-pawns and could leave black feeling cramped in the center if white manages to solidify their pawn chain. The game now hinges on black's ability to neutralize white's central space advantage and find active piece play to compensate for the slight structural weaknesses. Consider how the e5 pawn might become a target or a lever for future breakthroughs. Sharpening the central attack, The knight's redeployment to e4 aims to control key squares and potentially disrupt black's queenside pawn structure. A tactical geometry pivot. This redirection of the bishop to e5 aims to escape the immediate pin and potentially contest the central light squares that white's pawn push has opened, simultaneously preparing for a potential kingside maneuver. Securing the king's safety is paramount, and casting allows white to retreat the monarch behind a solid pawn shield, initiating a more serene phase of positional maneuvering. Securing the queen's central presence and preparing for potential pawn advances on the queen's side is the immediate aim, but it also subtly prepares to redeploy the knight from d5 to a more active square, potentially f6 or even e7, should the opportunity arise to control key central squares or support an eventual kingside attack. Pressing into the center, this pawn advance aims to disrupt black's developing harmony and secure a more dominant central presence for white's pieces, potentially cramping the opponent's queenside expansion and creating new avenues for attack or piece maneuvering. Instigating a dramatic pawn storm on the kingside, black's knight now boldly occupies the central outpost, threatening to disrupt white's nascent attacking structure and forcing a reassessment of immediate threats versus long-term positional goals. Unleashing the bishop's diagonal power clears the way for white's pieces, potentially creating open lines towards black's king. Black reclaims the bishop, and while this exchange simplifies the position somewhat, it importantly removes a white piece that was eyeing the kingside and clears the d6 square for potential future maneuvering. Notice how the doubled c-pawns now represent a significant structural weakness for black, creating permanent targets that white will undoubtedly try to exploit later. Unleashing the queen, this maneuver aims to exploit the newly opened diagonals and pressure black's uncastled king, hinting at potential tactical fireworks across the center. Securing the monarch with the castling maneuver now is a wise prioritization, addressing immediate safety concerns while setting the stage for potential counterplay on the d-file. It's a necessary step to avoid the lurking pressure white has built on the king side. Unleashing the rook to the d-file now exerts direct pressure on the isolated pawn and aims to dominate that crucial open file, potentially setting up a battery with the queen. The rook now eyes the open b-file, a crucial pathway that could soon become a battlefield for white's king if black can effectively exploit it. Securing that b-pawn and preparing for potential queenside expansion creates a robust pawn structure, aiming to solidify control over the central space and subtly prepare for future operations on the flank. Asserting central presence with the pawn advance, black aims to disrupt white's nascent attacking formation and reclaim some positional equality, potentially opening diagonals for the queen and bishop if white doesn't react decisively. The knight's journey to c5 immediately injects dynamism, aiming to exploit the pawn structure's inherent weaknesses and exert pressure on the queen side. White's intention is to disrupt black's already awkward pawn formation and potentially create a passed pawn if black isn't careful with their exchanges. Consider how this centralized knight might threaten squares like d7 or b7, forcing black to dedicate resources to its containment, thus potentially freeing up other pieces. This bold deployment also opens up possibilities for further pawn advances, creating imbalances that can be leveraged for a long-term advantage. It's a move that forces black to react and think about counterplay, rather than simply continuing their development. The queen vacates the d6 square, preparing to potentially challenge white's bishop pair and create active play on the queen side, hinting at a subtle shift in the game's focus from the center towards the wings. The knight's repositioning to d3 aims to exert pressure on black's queenside pawn structure and potentially eye the c5 square, creating a pivot point for future maneuvers. Unleashing the bishop to g5 repositions this piece to eye the enemy king's potential escape square, while simultaneously offering it for exchange, potentially clearing the d-file for greater influence. Reinforcing the central pawn structure and preparing to contest the open files, this maneuver creates a subtle yet significant repositioning of white's forces. The rook's relocation hints at future pressure along the e-file, potentially aiming to pry open lines towards black's king or exploit weaknesses in the pawn chain. It's a move that builds toward a more active role, orchestrating the pieces for a more decisive engagement, and asserting a claim over the critical central squares. The black queen makes a bold sortie to the queenside, immediately challenging the d3 knight and probing for weaknesses around white's king. This aggressive positioning, however, might be premature given the undeveloped nature of black's queenside pieces, potentially leaving the queen exposed to a swift counterattack. White needs to assess if this advanced piece can be trapped or if it will force a concession in material or positional advantage. An audacious thrust, nxc5 immediately creates fascinating complications, sacrificing a pawn for a powerful initiative and threatening to unravel black's kingside structure. Observe how white's queen now eyes the vulnerable kingside from the f3 square, while the knight's presence on e5 stifles black's development and limits piece mobility. This gambit forces black to make critical decisions about pawn structure versus piece activity, potentially leading to an exposed king if not handled with precision. The geometry of the board shifts dramatically, with white seizing the initiative and aiming for a quick attack rather than a slow positional build-up. The queen's audacious foray to the file gambles on creating immediate complications, but it might be prematurely exposing itself to white's consolidating forces and the vulnerable kingside. Reinforcing the central knight's control and preparing for potential pawn pushes on the kingside, this maneuver subtly aims to solidify white's foothold in the enemy's camp. A bold foray into enemy territory, demanding careful calculation. Black's queen, having achieved a temporary outpost, now needs to be swiftly redeployed to a safer, more coordinated position before white's pieces can converge for a decisive attack. Reclaiming the open e-file after the queen's excursion is a sound decision, preparing to potentially double rooks or simply re-establish a defensive posture. Sensing a positional concession after the queen's foray, black anchors their pawn structure, aiming to consolidate the center and prepare for a potential fight over the d-file. Aggressively pushing the queen forward to g3 initiates a fierce king hunt, aiming to shatter black's defensive pawn structure and expose the monarch to a torrent of attacking pieces. Unleashing a desperate check, black sacrifices tempo and potentially invites a dangerous discovered attack to salvage a collapsing queenside position, hoping to disrupt white's attacking rhythm. Safeguarding the monarch from immediate threats, this relocation prioritizes defensive solidity over aggressive aspirations in the face of black's unleashed queen and bishop battery. The queen's embarkation to c1, while seemingly active, offers white a significant positional advantage by centralizing his pieces and forcing concessions from black's compromised structure. Unleashing the rook along the open file to pressure the enemy queen, while simultaneously solidifying the pawn chain and preparing to contest the vital central squares, marks a strategic pivot aimed at regaining the initiative. Seizing the open file with the rook immediately initiates a direct assault, forcing white's pieces into a defensive posture and creating a delightful tactical dance across the chessboard. Reclaiming the sacrificed exchange, white decisively removes the immediate threat to the king and sets the stage for a material advantage, though the pawn structure has become somewhat compromised due to the recent exchanges. The endgame material is now drastically altered, and black, by returning the rook, seeks to capitalize on white's exposed monarch and a somewhat compromised pawn structure to find drawing chances or even turn the tables. The white king ventures out, a bold gamble for a king of the castle, embracing the open center that resulted from the exchange of pieces and the disruption of black's queenside pawn structure. This aggressive positioning, while potentially creating immediate attacking chances, leaves the monarch exposed to the remaining black pieces, especially the centralized bishop and the active rook now poised on the open file. White is banking on rapid development and a decisive attack before black can consolidate and exploit the king's adventurous placement. The recapture of the bishop solidifies black's material advantage, turning what was a complicated middle-game skirmish into a clear material win, and now the focus shifts entirely to navigating the ensuing endgame with an extra piece. The bishop embarks on a journey to solidify white's central presence and potentially exploit the open c-file once the rook exchanges. The pawn pushed to g5 attempts to create breathing room for the king and potentially disrupt white's control over the kingside. But it's a risky pawn sacrifice that opens crucial diagonal lines directly towards the black king, especially the one running through h6. A curious retraction, seeking to reroute the knight to a more defensive square after the queen's audacious raid. This knight's journey back suggests a slight adjustment in white's immediate aggressive intentions, perhaps to shore up the pawn's structure or prepare for a more subtle positional maneuver rather than a direct assault. It opens up avenues for black's pieces to become more active in the center, and the pawn on d3 now presents a potential long-term target if not properly defended. Sensing an opportunity, black repositions their bishop to a more aggressive diagonal, eyeing the vulnerable white king and aiming to disrupt white's newly formed pawn structure. Finally, the rook finds a constructive outpost, piercing the queenside and eyeing the vulnerable pawn structure around the black king. Solidifying the king's position becomes paramount with this relocation, steering it away from the open files and potential enemy incursions after the recent queen sacrifice and subsequent rook exchange. The white rook seizes the open file, initiating a powerful pressure campaign against black's compromised king position. Harnessing the open files for piece activity becomes paramount as black shores up their pawn structure, aiming to improve the knight's positioning while simultaneously creating potential passed pawn threats down the queenside. Harnessing the open diagonal, white liberates the knight to a potentially dominant square, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and exploit the exposed king. The rook's retreat to the third rank, rather than immediate contention for open files, concedes valuable tempo. A strategic blunder, allowing white's knight to penetrate the defensive ranks, creating immediate tactical threats against the isolated pawns and the king's security. The initiative has been handed over. This passive repositioning risks allowing white to consolidate their material advantage and initiate a decisive kingside assault, potentially trapping the black pieces. The queen should have sought more active defense or countered white's central dominance. The king now finds itself in a precarious position, exposed by the withdrawn defenders and vulnerable to white's concentrated attack. A dangerous game is being played. Such a move signals a lack of understanding of the current tactical situation, overlooking the immediate danger posed by white's coordinated forces. Reclaiming central outpost space becomes paramount after the queen's aggressive sortie, allowing knights to redeploy and potentially establish a formidable defensive structure. A strategic repositioning to potentially contest the open central files, aiming to improve the bishop's scope and offer some counterplay against white's advancing pawns. The king boldly ventures into the center, seeking active participation in the endgame's developing skirmishes. Pushing that pawn is an aggressive attempt to unravel white's defenses and create a passed pawn, aiming to disrupt the enemy's pawn structure and potentially exploit the open queenside files for activity. The rook vacates its current square, aiming to pierce the queenside defenses and capitalize on black's exposed pawn structure. The bishop retreats, but the recapture on a7 looks imminent, potentially trapping this piece and leaving black's queenside severely compromised. Dislodging that advanced pawn with a swift capture is key to breaking up black's central control and creating immediate threats on the queenside. Initiating a bold pawn push, black seeks to disrupt white's consolidated position and potentially open lines for counterplay, though it does create a potential weakness on the kingside if not handled carefully. Forcing the black king into a corner opens up possibilities to exploit its exposed position. Relinquishing the central files after the exchange allows white to establish a commanding outpost, but black's king now faces increased exposure on the kingside as those pawns advance. Asserting dominance on the open files with the king, white aims to solidify its pawn structure and potentially launch a new offensive. Embracing a fleeting tactical opportunity, black ignites a pawn chain reaction, seeking to disrupt white's developing advantage on the queenside and potentially activate their isolated bishop, though it leaves the king's safety exposed to further calculation. The king's exposed position becomes a significant weakness after this pawn capture, opening lines for black's pieces. Trading the bishop for the pawn opens up the f-file and creates a pawn majority on the kingside for black, but it also concedes the central control that the bishop had been helping to maintain, potentially allowing white's remaining pieces a more comfortable maneuvering space. Nabbing that pawn immediately activates the knight, eyeing potential discoveries and aiming to disrupt black's developing pawn chain. The bishop retreats to d4, a seemingly passive repositioning after the preceding exchanges. However, this subtle regrouping aims to redeploy the piece to a more active diagonal, potentially eyeing squares on the kingside where white's king has become increasingly exposed due to the pawn advancements. It's a patient maneuvering that might set up a future infiltration or support an eventual pawn push on the kingside. The white rook slides to c7, aggressively claiming the open file and pinning the black bishop to the king. This maneuver also sets up a potential squeeze along the 7th rank, aiming to disrupt black's defensive coordination and exploit the awkward placement of their pieces. That fork into the king's quarters is a desperate attempt to shake loose material, aiming to dismantle white's pawn shield before the inevitable endgame material disadvantage truly bites. The king scurries to safety, a vital defensive maneuver to escape the perpetual check and prepare for a potential exchange sacrifice that could unblock the queen's assault. The bishop's sudden appearance on the forward square, delivering that check, is a desperate attempt to disrupt white's advancing pawns and potentially tie down the king. It's a bold, almost flashy maneuver, forcing a reaction and perhaps creating a fleeting moment of disarray before white consolidates. Unburdening the king from the immediate threat allows white to focus on the material advantage and the vulnerable black king. The endgame is finally upon us, a dramatic shift from the earlier sharp Sicilian skirmishes. With that last capture, the pawn structure has been fundamentally altered, leaving white with a potentially awkward but ultimately more connected set of pawns that will be easier to advance. Black's pieces, though currently well placed, will need to be incredibly resourceful to navigate the open lines and the active white king that will soon join the fray. The control of the central files, particularly the d-file, will now become paramount for both sides. Asserting dominance on the central files becomes paramount after white's knight reclaims its outposted position. The bishop repositions, seeking a better vantage point to contest the open files and potentially disrupt white's king's safety in the ensuing simplification. Asserting control over the newly opened diagonal is paramount now, aiming to disrupt black's already precarious pawn structure and restrict its piece's activity. The king, finally free from the immediate danger, begins a slow march towards the queenside, aiming to support the advanced pawns and potentially participate in the final confrontation. The pawn advances, seeking to force a breakthrough on the queenside, potentially isolating and then gobbling up black's advanced but vulnerable pieces and creating a passed pawn threat. Pushing the king forward here seeks to mobilize black's royal presence towards the center, a common endgame goal, but it neglects the dangerous open lines white now controls and potentially exposes it prematurely to the enemy rook. The pawn's relentless march now forces a difficult decision, aiming to solidify its queenside advance by creating an unassailable passed pawn. Sacrificing a pawn to remove white's only active piece on the 7th rank is a desperate, but perhaps necessary attempt to simplify into an endgame where black might have some survival chances, though the material deficit remains substantial. Simplifying the material by exchanging minor pieces opens up the king's defenses for a decisive pawn push. Embracing the inevitable pawn promotion, black gracefully surrenders the bishop for the advanced threat, ushering in a simplified endgame where the kings will soon play a crucial defensive role. The pawn chain on the queenside crumbles as white secures the bishop, finally opening a pathway for their rook to penetrate deeper into black's territory, aiming to exploit the weak pawn structure and potentially force a resignation. Pushing the pawn forward now, while it seems like a small advance, strategically aims to create a passed pawn opportunity down the kingside if white isn't careful. Unlocking the king's desperate flight with a check forces a fundamental reshuffling of the remaining pieces, aiming to capitalize on the exposed monarch and create a winning advantage. The king ventures out, a bold but perhaps precarious stroll into the open, seeking to disrupt white's entrenched pawn structure and capitalize on the open files that now dominate the board. Securing the king behind the pawn chain offers a stable retreat, while the remaining pieces coordinate for the final push. Pushing that pawn forward unleashes aggressive potential, aiming to create a passed pawn and disrupt white's endgame setup, but it also leaves the kingside with fewer defenders. The bishop's new outpost on b5 creates immediate pressure, eyeing the d7 pawn and offering a defensive anchor against black's advancing kingside pawns, while simultaneously preparing to support a potential advance of the c-pawn. Clinging to the corner, the black king bravely seeks refuge on the g-file, hoping to escape the relentless pressure of white's minor pieces and avoid becoming a target in the increasingly open terrain. A bold repositioning, the bishop now stands sentinel on the e8 square, indirectly pressuring the h5 pawn while preparing to support any eventual pawn push or simply wait for developments on the kingside. Pondering the possibilities, the bishop now has an open path to become an active participant on the kingside, potentially threatening the white king's safety or creating an opportunity for a breakthrough. Consolidating the king's position offers a crucial defensive posture amidst black's advancing pawns, aiming to prevent further infiltration and prepare for potential counterplay should the opportunity arise. Prioritizing king's safety, black's pawn advances on the queenside to create an escape route, a necessary step given the open avenues towards his monarch and the lingering threat of white's centralized pieces. Finally, the bishop repositions itself to eye the pawn chain from a more advantageous diagonal. Unleashing the king's pawn forward creates an immediate tactical storm, forcing a dramatic reshuffle of white's pieces in this high-stakes endgame. Shifting the king forward to this central square anticipates the inevitable pawn promotion and seeks to establish control over a potentially crucial diagonal. Unleashing a pawn to create a decisive mating threat on the 7th rank, forcing a critical decision regarding the king's sanctuary and the pawn's destiny.